The rain fell in relentless, gray sheets, turning the asphalt of the forgotten highway into a dark, shimmering river. It hammered against the tin roof of the Dusty Fork, a diner that clung to the roadside like a barnacle, its neon sign flickering a tired, buzzing pink against the gloom. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of stale coffee, sizzling grease, and damp wool. For 17-year-old Alara, sitting alone in a cracked vinyl booth, it was a temporary sanctuary from the storm both outside and within her. Her world had shrunk to the circle of light cast by the low-hanging lamp above her table, illuminating a worn sketchbook and a single, half-empty mug of coffee she'd been nursing for the better part of an hour. Her pencil whispered across the page, tracing the memory of a windswept coastline, a place she had never seen but knew intimately from her father's stories. She was thin, with eyes that held the weary depth of someone much older. Her clothes, a faded flannel shirt and patched jeans, were clean but threadbare, marking her as a transient, a ghost passing through. Across the room, 3 local men, their youth curdling into a bitter, small-town arrogance, had noticed her. Their leader, a thick-necked man named Brock with a cruel set to his mouth, had been watching her for some time. His laughter, loud and abrasive, cut through the diner's low hum. "Look at that!" he sneered to his friends, loud enough for the entire room to hear. "Another runaway artist. Probably thinks she's too deep for the rest of us." His companions snickered in hollow agreement. Alara didn't look up. She kept her focus on the graphite lines, on the curve of a wave she was trying to perfect. Acknowledging him would be like offering a stray dog a scrap. It would only encourage him to stay. The waitress, a woman named Martha whose face was a roadmap of exhaustion, polished a glass behind the counter, her eyes deliberately averted. Intervention was a luxury she couldn't afford. The diner door swung open with a jingle of a small bell, admitting a gust of wind and 3 figures that seemed to suck the remaining warmth from the room. They were large men, built like brick walls and wrapped in heavy, road-stained leather. Patches adorned their vests, skulls, crows, cryptic letters that spoke a language of allegiance and violence. They were members of the Stone Crows Motorcycle Club. They moved with a heavy, deliberate confidence, their boots thudding on the linoleum floor. They took a large round table in the center of the diner, their presence an immediate, unspoken challenge to Brock's petty dominance. The leader, a man with a gray-streaked beard and eyes like chips of granite, settled into a chair that groaned under his weight. He was known only as Grizz. As they shook the rain from their jackets, their gaze swept the room, cataloging its occupants. They saw Brock and his cronies, dismissing them with a glance. They saw the tired families huddled in their booths. And they saw Alara, a small, solitary figure hunched over her sketchbook. One of the younger bikers nudged another, a low chuckle rumbling in his chest. "Look at the sparrow," he murmured, just loud enough for Grizz to hear. A long way from the nest, Grizz grunted, his eyes lingering on her for a moment longer than the others. There was a stillness about her that was unusual. But he, too, dismissed her, turning his attention to the menu Martha had nervously placed before them. In the quiet judgment of the room, Alara was invisible, a footnote in a dreary afternoon, utterly and completely alone. Brock felt the bikers' arrival not as a threat, but as an opportunity. Their presence created an audience, a stage on which he could perform his particular brand of casual cruelty and reassert his standing as the local alpha. Alara's deliberate ignorance of his earlier taunt had pricked his ego, and now, he decided, it was time to demand her attention. He pushed himself out of his booth, his friends watching with greasy smiles, and sauntered over to her table. He leaned over, his shadow falling across her drawing, eclipsing the soft light. "What's so interesting in that little book of yours?" he asked, his voice a slick, condescending drawl. "Secrets? Dreams? Or just more sad little pictures?" Alara's hand stilled on the page. She could smell the stale beer on his breath, feel the oppressive weight of his proximity. She slowly lifted her eyes to meet his, her expression unreadable, a placid mask over a churning sea of resolve. She said nothing, Her silence was a wall he couldn't seem to breach, and it infuriated him. He snatched the sketchbook from her hands. The sudden movement was violent, a violation that made her flinch. "Let's see what the little artist is hiding," he sneered, flipping through the pages with a callous thumb. The book was filled with landscapes. Desolate highways, gnarled trees, the intricate mechanics of an old engine, and page after page of a coastline she was trying to capture from memory. "Boring," Brock declared, his disappointment palpable. He had hoped for something he could mock, something personal and embarrassing. He held the sketchbook over her lukewarm coffee. "Maybe it needs a little something extra, a little coffee stain to give it character." The threat hung in the air, thick and ugly. The diner had grown quiet. The clinking of cutlery had ceased. The low conversation had died. Every eye was on them now. The families in the booths looked on with a mixture of fear and pity. Martha stood frozen behind the counter, a dishcloth twisted in her hands. The bikers at the center table had stopped talking. They watched the scene unfold with a detached curiosity. Like men watching a dogfight they had no stake in. This was not their town, not their problem. Not yet. Alara's gaze remained locked on Brock, her chin slightly lifted. She didn't plead. She didn't bargain. She simply watched him, her stillness a silent testament to a strength he couldn't comprehend. Her defiance, quiet as it was absolute. It was the defiance of a mountain against the wind, unmoving, unyielding, and utterly unimpressed by his blustering force. As Brock's shadow loomed over her, Alara's mind retreated to a safer, quieter place. The scent of grease and rain faded, replaced by the familiar aroma of motor oil, worn leather, and cheap cigars. She was back in the cluttered garage that had been her only real home, standing beside her father. His name was Michael, but everyone on the road had called him Saint. He was a tall, lean man with hands that were perpetually stained with grease but were surprisingly gentle. Those hands could coax a dead engine back to life, and they could hold a pencil with the delicate precision of a surgeon as he taught her how to see the world not just for what it was, but for the lines and shadows that composed it. "Dignity, Ellie," he used to say, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. "It's the one thing they can't take from you unless you give it to them. You hold on to it like it's the last dollar in your pocket." He had been a man of few words but deep principles, a knight-errant on a steel horse, his moral compass true north. The sketchbook in Brock's hands was the last thing her father had given her. It was a parting gift on a cold morning a little over a year ago, before he'd ridden out for a run with his club, a run from which he never returned. "Fill it with places we'll go someday," he had told her, tapping the empty cover. "Draw that coastline, the one I told you about. We'll see it together now." She was on her way to that very coastline, a solitary pilgrimage to honor a promise. She wasn't running away from anything. She was running toward the last piece of him she had left. Under the sleeve of her flannel shirt, a faint warmth spread from her left wrist. It was a familiar sensation, a phantom touch from the tattoo hidden there. It was more than ink. It was a pact, a symbol of her heritage, a permanent link to the man who had taught her that strength wasn't about being the loudest voice in the room, but the steadiest heart. The tattoo was a secret she kept close, a sacred inheritance from a world that bullies like Brock could never touch, let alone understand. Every line she drew in that book, every mile she traveled on this lonely journey, was an act of devotion to his memory. That sketchbook wasn't just paper. It was a testament, and she would not give him the satisfaction of seeing her break. Brock's patience, thin as it was, finally snapped. Her infuriating calm was a bigger insult than any shouted retort. With a guttural snarl, he shoved the sketchbook back at her, but his movement was intentionally clumsy. He caught the edge of her coffee mug, sending its contents sloshing across the table. The dark, lukewarm liquid soaked into the corner of her sketchbook and splashed onto her jeans. The sudden dampness a sharp, unpleasant shock. She flinched, a small, involuntary tightening of her shoulders, but no sound escaped her lips. The smell of stale coffee now clung to her, a cheap perfume of humiliation. The diner held its collective breath. The silence was absolute. broken only by the incessant drumming of the rain. Martha's hand flew to her mouth. The family in the adjacent booth pulled their children closer, shielding them from the ugliness of the scene. The bikers had all stopped eating. Grizz's eyes, hard and assessing, were fixed on Alara. The initial amusement was long gone, replaced by a flicker of something else. It wasn't pity. It was a kind of clinical observation, a weighing of her character in the crucible of this moment. He saw the spill, saw her flinch, and saw the immediate iron-willed control she exerted over herself. He saw her refusal to give the bully the reaction he craved. A younger biker next to him muttered, "Tough kid." And for the first time, Grizz didn't disagree. Brock smirked, a triumphant, ugly twisting of his lips. He had finally gotten a physical reaction from her, however small. He considered it a victory, but Alara denied him even that. Without a single glance in his direction, she reached for the paper napkin dispenser on the table. Her movements were slow, deliberate, almost graceful. She pulled out a handful of thin napkins and began to meticulously blot the coffee from the vinyl tabletop, her focus entirely on the task at hand. She carefully lifted her sketchbook, dabbing at the soaked corner, her expression one of mild annoyance, as if she were dealing with a minor, impersonal inconvenience, not a direct act of aggression. She was erasing him, negating his presence, rendering his pathetic display of power utterly meaningless. Her quiet, methodical dignity was a more potent weapon than any curse or threat. It was a shield he couldn't penetrate, and the realization that he had failed to truly touch her, to break her, began to curdle his victory into a sour, impotent rage. He stood over her, his fists clenched, the gazes of everyone in the diner feeling like physical blows upon his back. He had made his move, and somehow this silent, skinny girl was winning. The tension in the diner was a taut wire, humming with unspoken conflict. In the booth next to Alara's, a young mother tried desperately to soothe her crying toddler. The child, frustrated and weary, flung his small, red plastic toy car. It bounced off the seat and skittered across the floor, coming to a rest directly beside Brock's heavy work boot. The toddler's cries escalated into a full-blown wail, his small hand reaching out for his lost treasure. Brock looked down at the toy, a slow, malicious grin spreading across his face. Here was a new target, one even more helpless than the girl. He saw a chance to inflict a small, sharp piece of misery, to reassert his dominance by crushing this tiny piece of a child's happiness. He began to shift his weight, deliberately lifting his heel to bring it down on the plastic car. The mother let out a small, helpless gasp. The entire diner watched, paralyzed by the casual, pointless cruelty of the act. But before his boot could descend, Alara moved. She was a blur of motion, uncoiling from her seat with a speed that belied her quiet demeanor. She didn't shout or posture. She simply acted. She dropped to her knees on the grimy floor, her body a shield between Brock's boot and the toy. Her hand darted out, quick as a snake, and snatched the small car from the floor, her fingers brushing against the dirty leather of his boot. For a heart-stopping second, her hand was directly in the path of his intended stomp. It was a moment of profound, selfless risk, offered up for a stranger's child. Brock froze, startled by her sudden proximity and the sheer audacity of her intervention. Alara rose to her feet, ignoring him completely. She turned to the next booth and leaned over, extending her hand to the crying child. "Here you go," she said, her voice soft, the first words she had spoken in the diner. The toddler, his face streaked with tears, immediately stopped crying. He took the car with a sniffle, clutching it tightly in his small fist. The mother looked at Alara, her eyes wide with a profound, silent gratitude. She mouthed the words, "Thank you," a desperate prayer of thanks answered by the most unlikely of saviors. Alara offered a small, tired smile in return, a brief flicker of light in her somber eyes, before retreating to the relative safety of her own booth. She had nothing, yet she had just given everything she could to protect a small moment of joy for someone else. The atmosphere in the Dusty Fork shifted, the change as palpable as a drop in barometric pressure. The small, silent act of courage had tipped the scales. The bikers at the center table were no longer just observers. They were witnesses. Grizz leaned forward, his massive forearms resting on the table. His gaze locked on Alara with a new, intense focus. The lazy amusement was gone, replaced by a hard, sharp respect. He had seen countless bar fights, witnessed acts of brutal strength and drunken bravado, but this was different. This was quiet honor. This was strength of character, a currency his world valued above all else. He exchanged a significant look with his second-in-command, a silent communication that passed between them in an instant. This girl was not what she seemed. The whispers that had started among the other patrons now grew in volume. The diner's silent judgment had found a new target. "Did you see that?" A man in a booth whispered to his wife. He was going to crush it. The monster, the collective gaze of the room, once filled with pity for Alara, now burned with contempt for Brock. Brock felt the change instantly. The eyes on his back were no longer admiring or fearful. They were scornful. He had become the villain in a story he thought he was directing. His power was an illusion, shattered by a kneeling girl and a plastic toy. Humiliation burned in his gut, hot and acidic. He needed to reclaim control, to physically dominate the source of his shame. Rage overriding reason, he lunged toward Alara's booth. He grabbed her by the upper arm, his fingers digging into her flesh, intending to haul her to her feet, to scream in her face, to make her acknowledge his power. "Who the hell do you think you are?" he snarled, his face contorted in a mask of fury. He yanked her arm hard. The force of the movement pulled the sleeve of her worn flannel shirt upward, past her elbow. The fabric slid up her forearm, and for the first time, the skin of her inner wrist was exposed to the dim, yellow light of the diner. And the bikers saw it. There, on the pale skin of her wrist, was a tattoo. It was small, no bigger than a silver dollar, but its design was intricate and unmistakable. It was a single, stylized crow's feather, its barbs rendered in sharp, black lines, intertwined with the unmistakable silhouette of a vintage gear shifter. It was a symbol of art and mechanics, of freedom and machinery, woven into one. The moment Grizz's eyes fell on it, he froze. The coffee mug he was raising to his lips stopped dead in the air. The blood drained from his face, leaving his weathered skin a pasty white beneath his beard. His knuckles, gripping the mug, were bone white. He didn't breathe. The other stone crows, seeing their leader's shocking reaction, followed his gaze. One by one, as their eyes found the tattoo on the girl's wrist, they too went still. A younger member gasped audibly. The easy camaraderie, the low conversations, the clinking of forks, it all ceased. A profound, heavy silence descended upon the diner, a silence far deeper and more complete than before. It was as if the world had stopped turning on its axis. At that exact moment, a low rumble from outside began to grow, a distant vibration that quickly escalated into a deafening, ground-shaking roar. The diner's large plate glass windows began to vibrate in their frames, the cutlery on the tables rattling in sympathy. A blinding constellation of headlights sliced through the rain-soaked twilight, flooding the diner's interior with an intense, interrogating glare. A dozen, then 24 motorcycles were pulling into the gravel lot, their engines a thunderous chorus of raw power. They formed a phalanx, a chrome and steel army surrounding the small, isolated building. The diner door swung open again, and this time it was not just a few scouts, but the full might of the Stone Crows MC that filed in. They filled the doorway, their massive frames blocking out what little daylight remained. They were a legion of leather and denim, their faces hard, their eyes scanning the room. Their vice president, a man with a scarred face and cold, calculating eyes, led the way. He saw Grizz's frozen posture, followed his leader's stunned gaze to the small girl with her arm caught in Brock's grip, and then to the symbol tattooed on her skin. The entire club, now packed into the small diner, stood as one silent, imposing, and utterly focused entity. The air crackled with a sudden, terrifying energy. The balance of power had not just shifted, it had been annihilated. With a sound that seemed to crack the silence, Grizz pushed his chair back, its legs scraping violently against the linoleum. He rose to his full, intimidating height, a mountain of a man moved by a force that transcended anger. He didn't even glance at Brock, who was still holding Alara's arm, his face a mask of confusion and burgeoning terror. Grizz's entire focus was on the girl, on the small mark on her wrist. He took 2 heavy steps forward, his boots thudding with the finality of a judge's gavel. The sea of bikers parted for him, their eyes, like his, filled with a mixture of disbelief and reverence. He stopped directly in front of Alara. His voice, when he finally spoke, was not a shout, but a low, guttural rumble that seemed to vibrate in the very air of the room. It was a voice accustomed to command, now laced with a raw, unfamiliar emotion. "Where?" he began, his voice cracking slightly. "Did you get that ink?" Alara finally looked away from Brock, her gaze meeting Grizz's. She saw no threat in his eyes, only a deep, aching question. She pulled her arm from Brock's slackened grip. His bravado had evaporated, leaving behind a pathetic, trembling shell. "My father," she answered, her voice quiet but clear, carrying through the unnaturally silent room. "He arranged it for me. His name was Michael, but his brothers called him Saint." A collective sigh, a wave of recognition and sorrow, rippled through the ranks of the Stone Crows. The name hung in the air, sacred and heavy with memory. Grizz closed his eyes for a long moment, his bearded face a canvas of grief and awe. He turned his head slightly, addressing his club, but his words were for everyone in that diner. "Saint's kid," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he made no attempt to hide. "This is Saint's little girl." He then looked around the room, at the wide-eyed patrons, at the terrified waitress, and his voice grew stronger, taking on the tone of a man delivering a eulogy and a sermon all at once. "Saint," he explained, "was more than a member. He was the heart of this club, the best mechanic and the truest brother we ever had. He wasn't the biggest or the loudest, but his honor was legendary." He paused, swallowing hard. "A year ago, on a run-down I-5, a semi-jackknifed in the rain, Saint put his bike between that truck and a prospect, a new kid. He saved the kid's life and paid for it with his own. That feather," he said, pointing a trembling finger toward Alara's wrist, "that's his mark, a memorial. We give it only to his bloodline so we never forget our debt. So we never forget our saint." The truth settled over the diner, profound and transformative. Brock stood frozen, the implications of his actions crashing down on him with the force of a physical blow. He hadn't just bullied a lone girl. He had desecrated a sacred memory. He had laid his filthy hands on the daughter of a fallen hero, a princess of the very tribe he had so foolishly provoked. Grizz took another step forward, his movements now imbued with a gentle, paternal reverence. He softly took Alara's hand, his large, calloused thumb stroking the tattoo as if it were a holy relic. For a long moment, he just looked at it, his expression a mixture of profound sadness and fierce pride. Then, he slowly lifted his gaze and turned to face Brock. The kindness in his eyes vanished, replaced by a cold, merciless fire. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. His words were quiet, precise, and deadly. "You put your hands on the daughter of a stone crow," he stated, each word a chip of ice. "You disrespected the memory of a man whose boots you are not worthy to lick." Without another word, 2 of the largest bikers stepped forward, flanking Brock. They didn't touch him violently. They simply placed their hands on his shoulders, their grips like iron vices, and began to steer him toward the door. Brock's friends, pale and trembling, scrambled out of their booth, trying to make themselves invisible. The community of onlookers, the families, the truckers, Martha, watched in stunned silence as the source of the afternoon's ugliness was quietly and efficiently removed. There was no brawl, no shouting, just the calm, terrifying certainty of biker justice. Brock was escorted out into the rain, his fate left to the imagination, though no one doubted it would be severe. Inside, the atmosphere had been cleansed. Martha, her face streaked with tears of relief and awe, hurried from behind the counter. She placed a steaming plate of food, a thick burger and a mountain of fresh fries, in front of Alara. "On the house, honey," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "For you. For your father." Grizz returned to Alara's side. With a gesture that stunned the entire room, he began to unfasten his own kilt, the heavy leather vest that was the symbol of his identity, his rank, his entire life. It was covered in patches, each one telling a story of miles traveled, of battles won, of brothers lost. He gently, carefully, draped the impossibly large vest over Alara's small, slender shoulders. It engulfed her, a heavy mantle of leather and legacy. "Saint's blood runs in your veins," Grizz said, his voice low and solemn. "That makes you family. That makes you our own. You are under the protection of the Stone Crows now. Always." The small diner, once a place of isolation and humiliation for Alara, had transformed into a throne room. She sat in the booth, dwarfed by the weight and size of Grizz's vest, a silent queen holding court. The entire Stone Crow's MC now filled the space, a formidable honor guard standing watch. Some stood by the windows, their silhouettes dark against the stormy evening, silent sentinels. Others took seats in the surrounding booths, not eating, not speaking, simply being present. Their collective focus was on the small girl in the leather vest. The air, once thick with menace, was now filled with a profound sense of reverence and belonging. The low rumble of their idling motorcycles outside was no longer a threat, but a promise of unwavering protection. Alara looked down at the patches on the vest that covered her. She saw the skull with crow's wings, the club's main patch. She saw a patch that read President, and she saw a small, worn one near the heart that simply said, "In memory of Saint." She traced the letters of her father's road name, a tear finally escaping her eye and tracing a clean path through the grime on her cheek. It was not a tear of sadness, but of overwhelming relief. For the first time in a year, she was not alone. Grizz sat down opposite her, his expression softened by a paternal warmth. "Where were you headed, kid?" he asked gently. "All by yourself." Her voice was barely a whisper, but in the hushed diner, it was perfectly clear. "To the coast, near Arcata. There's a cliff overlooking the ocean." He said it was the one place where the road ended and you could feel the whole world breathe. "He promised he'd take me." Grizz nodded slowly, a deep understanding in his eyes. He knew the place. Saint had talked about it often, his one patch of peace. He stood up and looked around at his men. No command was needed. A single, decisive nod was enough. "Well," Grizz said, turning back to Alara and offering her a calloused hand. "A promise is a promise. Saint can't take you, so we will." Alara looked at his outstretched hand, then up at his face, and for the first time that day, a genuine smile touched her lips. She took his hand and let him help her from the booth. She walked out of the dusty fork, no longer a solitary, invisible girl, but the charge of a brotherhood. Grizz himself helped her onto the back of his gleaming Harley-Davidson, carefully adjusting his vest around her shoulders. She wrapped her arms around his waist, pressing her face against the worn leather that smelled of rain, gasoline, and home. With a signal from Grizz, 30 engines roared to life in perfect, thundering unison. The sound was a declaration, a symphony of loyalty that echoed across the desolate highway. The procession pulled out of the gravel lot, a formidable river of chrome and light, with a small, quiet girl at its heart, riding toward the sea to fulfill a father's promise, her father's legacy roaring to life all around her. Back at the diner, Martha and the patrons stood at the window, watching the taillights disappear into the rain, forever changed by the sparrow they had ignored, who had turned out to be an eagle.